Welcome to Careers Takeoff, where you learn the latest about how you can get ahead in your career. I'm your host, Conrad Chua. Welcome everyone, I'm Conrad, I'm your host for today. Before we get started, if you're new to the show, you can put your questions in the comments field, whether you're watching us on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook. You can start by writing down where in the world you're watching this from today. And given the topic, today's topic, what advice would you give to Elon Musk to reduce disinformation on Twitter? Hopefully, Twitter will still be around by the end of this live stream. The way things are going, we don't know. Anyway, this week, the US midterms happened. And we continue to see candidates who espouse ideas, views that arise from disinformation. We all know the impact that disinformation, fake news can have and has had on elections, public attitudes towards COVID. But not much has been said about the impact that it can have on business. So our guest today, Professor Alan Jaglinza, thinks that this is serious stuff and businesses need to think more carefully about it. Welcome, Alan.
Hey, Conrad. Good to see you. Thanks for allowing me to join you.
So, Alan, you've made this your almost a personal, professional mission to think more or get people to think more about the impact of disinformation. I think you wanted to start off by asking or clarifying what is it that we're talking about?
Yeah, so this is a passion of mine, and I see it as the primary accelerant for all problems. So if we're dealing with climate, if we're dealing with healthcare, if we're dealing with things like genocide, war, you see it happening in Ukraine, for example, it all runs on a disinformation engine. And yeah, I think it's important that we start the discussion with some definitions. So if you don't mind, I borrowed these from the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity, and I posted a link on the LinkedIn page that we're hosting for the Disinformation Summit that I think we'll discuss in a little bit. But I'm going to start with disinformation in the middle, which is intentional. I think that's the core piece to this notion of disinformation, is that there is an active intent to mislead people for personal gain or to have some influence over people. Misinformation happens often subsequent to that. So misinformation is lacking the intent to harm other people, but it may be that we're sharing information that's just not correct because we have a belief system or, Conrad, you had said something and I trust you. And so I spread information that you've pushed into the system. And the third definition is malinformation, which is described as information that has a source of truth, but it's manipulated in a way to be harmful. So it's placed out of context. I think, I tend to focus more on disinformation, which is intentional in part, because as accountants, we've been dealing with this throughout our entire, everything that we talk about, which is in our world, it's around fraud. Financial fraud, misreporting, intentions to manipulate markets. And now in our space, it's also greenwashing. We'll see this in greenwashing, where we're sort of falsifying data, perhaps, to misrepresent our impact in the environment. So I thought that would actually be helpful to start with definitions to help us with the discussion.
Great, Alan. And the link that Alan is talking about, it's down there in the comments if you want to follow that later on. But Alan, I'm interested to know, why are you personally and professionally so invested in this? Because I remember when you mentioned to me before, when you told people about this disinformation summit that you're organizing, people were wondering, why are you, an accounting professor, looking at this?
Well, for one, just professionally, accounting is inherently an information science. And everything that we're doing is providing arguably safer information streams because people are making very important decisions, not just financial decisions, but actually societally relevant decisions based on the information quality that they're obtaining. And so we've done lots of research in information quality and how people process information in primarily financial markets and what are the effects on stakeholders who have a financial stake. Well, now, reflecting over the past 3+ years, it actually probably goes back much deeper. I've just seen, as we're sitting through, for example, the pandemic, I'm seeing this internalizing all of this effective disinformation on society even broader. So the societal implications of financial malfeasance, like if I misreport, a good example would be Carillion, the Carillion scandal in the UK. If I lie, presumably intentionally, about my financial health, yes, I got financial stakeholders who lose money, but also society lost because we didn't have hospitals that were built. So Carillion was an infrastructure builder, and so railways, hospitals. So there are societal implications of lying, if you will, disinformation in our framework. But as I'm sitting down looking at our world right now, we're seeing literally wars that are being driven on a disinformation engine. We're seeing excess deaths from the pandemic related to disinformation, and all of the initiatives that we care about, arguably with respect to progress, for example, on climate initiatives, they are being disrupted by disinformation campaigns. And as we're going to talk about more detail, businesses are also being disrupted by disinformation campaigns. So I just see it as an extension of information science, and accounting is an information science.
Right. Alan, there was one thing, before we go on to disinformation, one thing you mentioned, which I hadn't really thought about, was you mentioned that accounting is an information science, and you have ideas of, or regulations about how companies report financial data, but you also have to think about how stakeholders perceive that data, or take on board that data and form an opinion. Can you talk very briefly about how does that work?
So actually, I was having conversations even with one of our colleagues here yesterday. It's interesting because we come in as economists with this notion that people rationally absorb data, and that they're actually skeptical when they see information coming to them. And I think that's a reasonably safe assumption in financial markets, where you have people who put money on the line. Presumably, many have been trained, and so they're sophisticated. They also have some idea of where somebody could commit fraud, and they can scrutinize it. And so people are reasonably sophisticated. I think our assumptions and our models are a sophisticated user to some level, and a skeptical user, one who applies critical thinking and even evidence-based analysis. But as I'm reflecting on what we've just been through and what we're currently going through this environment, I also realize now that there are many people who aren't that way, and we aren't really thinking about them, and they're also absorbing information. And what's even interesting about it is they're ignoring the information that is from arguably credible sources. And so this is a subset that I don't think our research and accounting has really reflected on. The people who choose not to engage with the information that we're providing, which is debatably safer than others, because in our field, we deal with so much infrastructure. We have financial reporting standards, we have audit committees, we have governance, we have regulators, we have shareholder lawsuits. Like, there's a whole lot of governance around what we do. And even within our space, we have fraud in our space. But now you move out and you expand scope, and now you've got a whole bunch of people who simply just believe. And if you try to introduce any counter narrative or any evidence-based narrative, they not only will shut it down, but in some cases they move straight into ad hominem attack. And so that's kind of the space that I'm now trying to explore, because I don't fully understand it. And I do think that's a very rich avenue for us to explore. Like, why is it happening? How do we reach that audience? What are the implications of that? So that's kind of where I thought we could expand scope, at least within the domain that I'm working in.
Okay, great. So, Alan, before we talk about whether companies are treating disinformation seriously, I just wanted to shout out some of our viewers here. So, James is from the UK. Hi. Mikey's from New York. We've got Alex from Dubai. Keshni's from South Africa. And Marco, who I think is a current student in CJBS. He's watching this from London. So thanks, everybody.
Welcome.
And remember, if you've got any questions for Alan or any comments, please put them in the chats. Alan, so are companies treating disinformation seriously?
Well, that's a general statement, and I'm often careful not to overgeneralize. I don't know that they're really thinking that carefully about it. I think some companies are probably more sensitive to it than others, and perhaps it's because they've actually been victimized by it, or they're more open to the potential damages of disinformation. So I think it's a company by company case, but I don't know. Let me say it differently. We had a conversation with a partner at PwC and Matt Gorham. We actually have on YouTube a video of that session that we did, and he's out there consulting with companies, and it seems as though this really hasn't hit the radar. And in the conversations I've had with some board members, it's not really on the radar. I don't know that people are really sensitive to what the implications are with disinformation. And I would sense that we need to have more awareness about it. And by the way, I view two paths. There's a direct path of impact, and then there's an indirect path of impact that we'll potentially unpack through the session.
I mean, in a way, Alan, I thought disinformation has always been kind of a business risk, right? I listened, sorry, I think I learned from a podcast how it was late 19th century, early 20th century, dairy producers in the US spread false rumors about what goes into margarine. And for the benefit of the viewers, whom some of you might be having lunch or dinner right now, I won't tell you what they said. It's not very nice. But they were effective because then the US population just didn't eat margarine, didn't like margarine. And their profit margins were preserved. So is that any different from what happened in the past?
So I don't think it's different. So we actually had another colleague who actually runs, it's worked with the Ministry of Defense, and he's an expert on propaganda. And he did a whole historical on this notion of propaganda and disinformation. It's not new. It's the tactics have been used throughout history. I think what is more recent or more is the amplification of the disinformation channels, the ability to not only push it out faster, but also to get it to attract deeper and hit people who are preconditioned to believe in it. So I actually pushed a paper. There's a paper that I cite in the LinkedIn channel that we have on the Disinformation Summit that speaks, for example, to micro-targeting. And this relates to some of the research that's done here with the Psychometric Center with David Stilwell. And you should actually interview him on some of his research with respect to micro-targeting and the ability to very precisely identify audiences who are really adept or who are ready to absorb specific types of data or specific types of messaging. And so I think our ability to precisely nail down an audience and get it right into them and get it into their psyche and their belief structure and trigger them emotionally so that they'll spread it is higher. So I sense, and then it's also a global dissemination, almost literally instantly through these avenues. So I think the vehicles are very vibrant now. It's the megaphone, the amplification tools are very rich. So I think that's the biggest issue. Yeah, I'll quit there. I have a lot of thoughts too about that particular margin example. If you want.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. It just occurred to me that when you were saying how the amplification is so much greater now, I think in the margarine example, the news was spread through newspapers and the railways that was delivering papers, right? And so before that, probably you could only spread news around your town, maybe just a borough in your city, but thanks to the railways and thanks to the printing press, it just exploded across different states. But we've got a comment here from Felipe.
Sure.
And I guess Felipe is from Brazil. And obviously, Brazil just had their own presidential elections. And he says disinformation and fake news has greatly harmed presidential elections per se. Alan, I know you run these webinars on that build up to the Disinformation Summit. What have people been saying about the impact that disinformation has had on democratic processes?
It's decayed. I mean, it's unambiguously decayed democracy because, again, with micro-targeting, you're allowed to hit populations and hit them with belief structures that align to what they want to hear. And it's created echo chambers, polarization. So social media is a core component, from my understanding, of the decay. So it's allowed for a lot of polarization, particularly, and then deep entrenchment of prior beliefs. This is one of the reasons, one of the benefits of the Disinformation Summit webinars, which again are most of those are posted on YouTube, is, for example, we had a discussion with a Joseph Pierre, who's a physician. He's a psychiatrist with the UCLA Medical Center, and he's done a lot of work on conspiratorial beliefs, willful ignorance, and self-deception. And I had to reach out to him to understand, like, why do people become entrenched in these beliefs? And so he goes through that. I won't take away his punchlines, but he does a very nice job of articulating kind of the belief system structure. And that, then, if you know that going in, then you can run campaigns to try to create this polarization and this division. And I think we've seen that if one actually unpacks, for example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, you can see that sort of, I think, underlies the Brexit campaign, some of the U.S. political division that we've seen. So I think that threading, I think my understanding is there's a sense of a commonality across these. And when we get into business stuff, going back to the margin example, the margin example is what I consider to be one of the cases of direct effect on businesses. So the ways in which I might directly try to harm your business would be to push information out that's false, that would ideally try to manipulate your market price, ruin your reputation, ruin people's perception of your product and the safety of your product. So if you're a pharmaceutical company, if you're a food product, particularly if you're new. So if you're new into the food business, for example, I think we had a speaker here the other day who was talking about live cultured meat. I guess you can do stem cells and create meat. I'm not familiar with the market, but you can imagine where traditional meat producers might actually try to communicate information about the safety of that kind of product. So these are kinds of the direct effects, and we're starting to see concentrated campaigns. In fact, I think it was Matt Gorham who had specified that it's very inexpensive to hire bots. And if one wanted to, it wouldn't be too difficult to push a bot campaign out to target specific companies. And I actually see, although it's not clear whether it's targeting Twitter and Musk or whether it's targeting like Eli Lilly as one example. We're seeing that on Twitter right now with the new campaign that's sort of parody, $8. There's a whole lot buzzing around this $8 verification and parody, this notion of parody accounts. But they're really undermining some of the businesses that are out there right now. And I don't know whether it's intentional to harm the businesses or intentional to harm Twitter and Elon Musk's ego. I don't know what the rationale behind it is, but those are examples of direct campaigns. And I would argue that these are probably the least damaging relative to some of the indirect effects that I don't think companies are prepared for. And we can discuss those if you want, but I'll take a break for the moment.
Okay. Just to let people know, this is the. Wait, let me just put this on. A segment from the talk that Alan was mentioning, and the QR code up in the upper right hand corner, I think, that will bring you to the Disinformation Summit YouTube channel, right?
Thanks.
Yeah, and actually, Alan, someone's interested. What was the name of the...
Joseph Pierre, Pierre, from UCLA.
Okay.
So he's also known, I think he's still on Twitter. His Twitter handle is Psych Unseen. So you may be able to find him on Twitter too. And he has blogs out there. If you Google Psych Unseen, you will probably find him as well through the blog. That's actually how I found him. Yeah, I think that's him.
Is that it? Okay.
That should be right.
Hopefully he's still on Twitter since...
yeah, and hopefully he's not been impersonated by somebody who paid $8.
But Alan, you talk about companies treating disinformation and risks. How should they be thinking about these risks, and what can they do to mitigate those risks?
So the direct risks, let me talk about the indirect risks first, and then I'll answer the question about what I think they can do. And again, I'm going to refer also to Matt Gorham's talk, because he actually consults on this. So I don't want to take any thunder away from his talk. And again, he's also on our YouTube. But with respect to, so I talked about some of the direct risks, which are, I'm a disinformation chaos actor, whether I'm state sponsored, meaning that I'm like from country X and I'm a politician and I have some intention to take down a particular company. The alternative might be that I'm even a competitor and I might want to take you down, or maybe I'm trying to manipulate your market price and I'm trying to profit from trading. So those are kind of the more direct things. Oh, one other avenue for direct now that we're seeing is we're seeing companies, and I shouldn't say companies, people within companies taking politically charged positions on issues. So, for example, if you see the CEO of company X taking a position on abortion rights, or if you see CEO of company Y taking a position on gun rights, or we also have Chick-fil-A in the United States, which is a major food chain. Their CEO, I think, has very strong opinions about LGBTQ plus community. So anytime anybody of power or prominence takes a position, or then in this politically charged environment, that might trigger some action, some backflash, which may actually include some disinformation campaigns. So part of the discussion is also, are you aware of the implications of your choices to take a position on a politically charged? What does that do? And so thinking through what the counter effects might be of that. I view those as the direct method. The indirect stuff I actually think is more insidious, and I don't think people are thinking about them. So some of the examples are geopolitical risk. For example, we had the listener from Brazil talking about the implications on elections. Well, one classic example of geopolitical risk resulting from disinformation that could catch a company off guard is Disney. Out of nowhere, probably out of nowhere, maybe because Disney sort of didn't take a position on a politically charged issue, and some politicians in the United States felt they should. Then all of a sudden, they were subject to certain attacks as a result. So that was sort of indirect, and I think that may have some effect on them. But more directly, an indirect effect is geopolitical risk. So even if you aren't thinking about disinformation directly coming at you, you may be subject to the underlying geopolitical risk. BP is a classic example. So BP was holding a long position in Rosneft. They had a major holding in Rosneft. And all of a sudden, disinformation is fueling the Russian aggression into Ukraine. And then there is a decision on what should we do about our Rosneft holdings, and the fact that our CEO is on the Rosneft board. And I would suspect that that was probably unexpected. And so it's not like you're planning for these kinds of events, but I do think companies, when they make decisions about investment in other countries, need to be very aware of the political implications of the disinformation campaign. So, as an example, if I were making a long investment in infrastructure in Brazil, recognizing that, using your listeners' perspective, that there may be disinformation fueling the underlying politics in Brazil, that is almost certainly going to create some uncertainty around the safety and security of my investment as a corporation in Brazil. Another really important and vibrant disinformation effect on business right now is workforce polarization. And I don't think we're thinking carefully about the HR implications of disinformation. People are walking into our communities and they are very strongly opinionated now. And they're listening to very strong information silos. And so it may degrade your ability to work as a team on any project. Now, there are some corporations and entities where that's not going to be a problem, because most likely they're like-minded. So, for example, if you're doing non-meat alternatives, vegan type meat products or whatever, my guess is that you're very likely more like-minded than, and so it's likely that everybody in that workforce probably is reading off of the same sort of echo chamber, if that makes sense. So they're probably aligned. But if you're working in, I don't know, vehicle manufacturing, I'm making stuff up. I don't know which industry is a broader industry pool, you may actually have people who literally can't get along anymore and they can't communicate anymore in your workforce. And that may cause tension, and that may actually derail some of the things that you're dealing with. Other kinds of indirect effects would be forced migration. So we're seeing a lot of forced migration related issues as these things happen, and that changes the entire dynamic of there's like macroeconomic effects. It plays into the geopolitical risk. It plays into consumer demand in certain markets. We also see supply chain disruption, which is also part of the geopolitical risk. So there are many indirect effects associated with disinformation campaigns, and it's something that I think everybody should be aware of, and I think this should be a discussion in the boardroom. I'll take a pause, but I want to reflect it or recognize that I didn't answer your question about what companies should do about this. And I can go to that now if you want, or take a breather. I can't hear you.
It'd be sorry, Hal.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, no, yeah. It'd be useful actually for you to talk a bit about who in the board should be surfacing this sort of issues and how they should be discussing. But before that, I see that Marco had a question, and on LinkedIn. But I wonder if Marco can just clarify. He says, with checks and balances in society, do you see any benefits in disinformation? And Marco, if you could,
I don't.
if you could just clarify what you mean by benefits before we go there.
Yeah, I have
Alan,
a very hard time. Yeah. So the only time I can see potential benefits in disinformation might be if you're, it's so I have seen disinformation used as a wartime tool. And so if you want to engage in warfare, political warfare, psychological operations has been done throughout history. Is that a benefit? It depends on what perspective you want to come in with. It gets into some moral issues too, as to whether I want to try to torpedo Conrad's company using disinformation. I'd rather compete head to head on quality than that, but a lot of it's around the ethical compass, I think. And I recognize too that I still need to answer your question about things companies can do to mitigate. And also, let me first get to your question about so anybody involved with the risk. So I think, first of all, companies' chief risk officers need to really think about this. So it may not necessarily hit the board level yet, but I do think companies or boards should be asking the chief risk officer about what are you doing about disinformation, particularly if they are subject to being targeted by product. The direct ones are easier to get your head around. Who's going to come out and challenge our product? Who's going to come out and try and manipulate our stock price? How do we counter narrate that? How do we get people involved who are influencers to run a inoculation campaign? And there are studies that I've also posted into our LinkedIn channel about inoculation, this notion of getting in front of the messaging, like almost anticipating it might come and getting out a narrative that we are trustworthy, you can trust us, here's the evidence. So a lot of this is based on actually some of the fundamentals we do in accounting, which is open, transparent processes, and saying, look, we have transparency, we have nothing to hide. This is how we go about our work. Scientific data, if you're a pharmaceutical company, as one example. So trying to get ahead of the narrative and getting influencers out there, and also monitoring, social media, trying to take down. And there are many companies also that work on reputation management. So now that's a big industry. And so it may be that you as a corporate executive want to hire a reputation manager who can monitor this stuff. So that's one way. And also from the geopolitical risk perspective, just thinking carefully about the investments you have elsewhere, and thinking in terms of, what is the, how likely is it that the country or the audience in this area is susceptible to disinformation? And actually, one of the things I want to explore, it may already exist, is whether there's sort of an index on disinformation susceptibility. The reason I bring that up, and I don't know, it might exist, but for example, from what I understand, Finland, I think it's Estonia, they have documented systems where they're teaching disinformation and propaganda in their grade schools to their children, because apparently they're subject to a lot of disinformation campaigns from Russia. That's my understanding. And so they want to teach critical thinking skills and evidence-based thinking skills and propaganda techniques to their children, and arguably or debatably they've been known to have the most disinformation resistant populations because of the structure. And so thinking in terms of, where are we at most at risk for these kinds of things.
We'll come back to this idea about what can we do to educate or inoculate people.
Okay.
And I guess what you're saying is that boards, corporations, in a way, they have to start thinking about disinformation the same way that they treat other risks that they may have in their risk register, in their war room sort of scenario planning kind of things.
Yeah, and actually,
yeah.
let me clarify that too. The other thing I want to say about disinformation risk is it is not independent of these other risks. It amplifies these other risks. So disinformation amplifies every other risk. So think of it in terms of how much amplification, how much does it exacerbate these other risks? So it's baked in. So climate risk is amplified by disinformation as one example. So now we have a lot of reporting around climate risk. It's amplified. The impact of it is amplified by it. So thinking of it in terms of that disinformation is a megaphone or an amplification. I call it an accelerant for all the other risks. That's how I view it.
Okay. We have to talk about the big elephant or in the room kind of thing and that's Elon Musk and Twitter.
The big bird. Hopefully, the big bird. It's not an elephant. It's
yeah. Hopefully the company is still around by the end of the week. But what would your advice be to Elon Musk, setting aside all the business side and what he's doing on the HR side, but what changes to Twitter should he make to curb disinformation?
Well, first, don't fire your trust team. So I think one has to get into his mind, which is probably very difficult to do, to understand. So when I first heard he was going to try to buy Twitter, people were asking me, what do you think of that? And I said, well, I'm going to hold judgment because I don't know what his utility function is. I don't know really what he's intending to do. Now that I've seen some evidence, I still really don't know what he's intending to do. If he's trying to minimize disinformation, he's going about it the wrong way. And I think part of the parody accounts are trying to very strongly illustrate that to him and basically say, look, this isn't working. You've amplified our ability to completely throw complete garbage into the system and even malignantly intended garbage. So the parody accounts are using it to kind of drill a message home to him. There's a lot of questions, and we're going to bring them up in the summit. And I don't want to pretend that I'm the expert on this answer, but there are a lot of debates around free speech rights, which we should cherish, and liability for deliberately harmful information. So we have in some countries defamation laws, but they're incredibly hard to pursue as a plaintiff. So at some point, at what point do we get to hold liable the broadcasters? And I had a talk with a colleague a few days ago that, I know in the United States, you can trace back, for example, I think it was the Reagan administration. I may be wrong on the history, where they eliminated some regulation that required balance in news media. So apparently if there was a left-wing commentary, there had to be a right-wing commentary matched to it. That's my understanding of it loosely. And this is going way back. And then that allowed, I think, the proliferation of one-sided narrative. So that might be one avenue to think about. Another avenue would be, sort of the introduction of some sort of audit. I mean, we have audit in financial reporting, which is one of the things that baffles me. Why do we get away with very, very, very strict rules on communication and accounting and audit and regulation that includes the potential for civil or criminal penalties in a world where we have free speech rights? And that's interesting because we already have a framework for how one is legally allowed to communicate in my world. But then you move over into the Twitter space and it's like, oh, no, free speech rights. I can say whatever I want. So the question is sort of like, what mechanisms could we do here? Is fact checking enough? Does it have to be independent? Should it be the responsibility of the Twitterverse? Should it be self-policed somewhat through moderation system and a crowdsource like Wikipedia sort of does? When should the government get involved? Do people trust the government to get involved? So these are all the questions. This is, to be honest, this is one of the reasons I'm hosting the summit, because I certainly don't know the answers to this. And so we're bringing in scholars from authoritarian studies, psychology, legal. So, I mean, some of these questions are legitimately constitutional law and securities law professors and attorneys. We're bringing in people from a whole slew of different backgrounds so that we can debate and discuss these issues. I don't really know what the answer is to this. I, my personal preference would be that the platforms that disseminate this information should have some liability for it. To me, it's a weapon. It can be weaponized, and if they're callously handing out the weapon, they should be held accountable for the distribution of the weapon. That's just, maybe that's a bad analogy and people can push back on that analogy, but in my mind, I sense that they should have some liability. But I don't know what infrastructure we can do that safely, recognizing that we really do want to allow people to use these platforms to say things that are important to say. So it's a very, very, very interesting dilemma.
Charles posted, Charles from Milton Keynes posted, the amount of disinformation on Twitter will probably halve when people get bored of poking fun at Elon Musk. But one of the things
I'm not so sure that's good. By the way, I'm not so sure. I'm not. I'm gonna let me comment on that. So I actually posted on Twitter an article about narcissistic injury, and I think people should read up on narcissistic injury. And what's interesting about narcissistic injury is it triggers narcissistic rage. And so when you see this, it becomes a cycle. And I don't know that people will actually stop having fun. So I think there's going to be a feedback loop that continues. I don't see this stopping. I think people are going to continue this as long as Twitter exists.
I mean, a lot of people have made fun about this $8 subscription, right? To get so-called this blue check. Is it verified? Is it not verified? But actually, I heard someone say that maybe that can get rid of some of the bot farms, because now, before they might have 1,000 bot accounts. Now they've got to pay $8,000 a month. Maybe it's not so profitable. And I think this comes down to the next point, really, which is, where do you see salvation coming from? Is it going to be a sort of a market mechanism? Is it going to be, do we trust companies, publicly traded companies, to do the right thing? Or should governments get involved?
The only thing I've seen so far that effectively works is educating our children on hitting their own impulse pause button and evaluating through critical lens. So to me, I think the key is to teach people to be cynical, skeptical, reflect, and look for converging evidence. I mean, we're taught that as scientists. We have to do that in order to be credible. I think it's safe. I think anybody who's gone, and most people who recognize that they've actually been victimized by this type of tactic, I think they're very sensitive to it now, and they tend to verify before trust. So, I mean, I don't want to make everybody paranoid, but I think a level of understanding there is the only thing that I've, at least from the evidence I've seen, is actually really, really effective. After that, then I guess it's sort of a hybrid project. I think there's going to have to be some government intervention to hold some accountability, and to recognize that, if you want Facebook, Twitter, TikTok to be accountable, then there has to be some government regulation. I think the EU probably has some pretty decent starter guidance on that. I think they're leading, from what I can tell, on some of these initiatives. So there has to be some teeth, and there has to be some teeth that actually matters. And, when you get into the Musk scenario, there's some debate about whether fining him matters to him, right? So if you fine him, does he care? Things like that. So, but I guess some of the other evidence I've seen, Citizen Data, I started working a little bit with some of their analysis. Citizen Data has some interesting stuff where they've actually done surveys and they penetrated some of these thought groups to understand these belief systems and who are the influencers. And often the influencers are not people you would think. People with title, they tend to stick away from, like professors and media commentators, because in government officials, they definitely don't trust. So they're more likely to trust, of all people, firefighters. So they actually have, and I posted a link to some of their stuff. It's they are specifically looking in Arizona. They did a survey in Arizona with Arizona voters. So it's not a very generalizable study, but it was interesting, at least for them to think about who might actually be able to get messaging through to you, and how one might actually be able to go through, and actually get to them. So there's some stuff there that might allow us to think about how we can actually penetrate these belief systems, to get other data down there. So maybe that's helpful.
And that's the link if people want to read more about narcissistic rage, right? And Charles talked about, I think the International Baccalaureate has a theory of knowledge, I guess it's a program. So it provides an opportunity for students to reflect on the nature of knowledge and how we know what we claim to know. So quite philosophical there. Alan, very quickly, what do you think business schools should be doing to educate our students about disinformation, also about how to protect ourselves from disinformation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a very precise answer, because I'm actually trying to build at least an elective on this, cobbled together with that. I think one of the core elements is that one of the core things we need to teach is that people are not like us in their belief structure. So we have a tendency to pull in people, despite the fact that, particularly here in Cambridge, we're global. So we pull in people from all kinds of belief systems and all kinds of cultures. But we all agree in some sense that learning, education, and the fact that we're from different, if we pull together a classroom, we get 100 different opinions, and sometimes we debate, and sometimes we don't agree, and that's learning. But not every, but we want to be in this classroom, so we're okay with that, and we're actually excited for that. But people are polarized outside of that, and they don't want that experience, and in fact, they'll repel against it, and some people will violently repel against it. So one of the core recognition is recognizing or understanding is that we have to really realize that when we go out and we're pushing our products and we're pushing our services into the ecosystem, we are in a world where people don't see the world the way we do. And so getting our heads around the psychology of that is really critical. And then the value, the other piece that we really have to teach is the value of the credibility of information systems. I want everybody to imagine a world where we don't have control. And that's a terrible word. We don't have validity check is the better way of framing it on information. I mean, we're making decisions about deals, we're making decisions about relationships, even marriage level relationships and partnerships, life partnerships, based on information asymmetry. And if we can't validate the quality of the information flows, then everything breaks down, and we end up literally with genocide as some outcomes. And so I think thinking very carefully about how do we preserve validity checks on information systems is critical, and bringing that into the classroom is key. That's sort of where I would go with this.
Yeah, this idea of doing reference checks before you get married. I don't know how marriages are going to go.
Prenups.
How many? Yeah.
Yeah.
But we have one
Skeptical
final.
thinking.
Skeptic, yeah. One final comment from a colleague of ours, Aidan, who asked, "This
Good idea.
record $1.44 billion damages judgment against conspiracy theorist Alex Jones. Could that be a turning point to discourage other purveyors of disinformation?"
I suspect no. I hate to say it, but this actually gets into a longer conversation where I worked. This is on the accounting YouTube website, not the Disinformation Summit. But I worked with a convicted fraudster, Sam Antar, and he says that a criminal mind does not think rationally, and so the idea that a punishment might try to reduce the probability that somebody might act inappropriately, that relies on a notion of rationality that doesn't really exist in practice. And so it's a long conversation, but Sam Antar, Antar, I interviewed him And I have his contact information, but he's done a lot of work in this area about how they think very differently, and also the probability of this outcome is really, 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 really low. And Alex Jones will never pay that amount. That's just a judgment. That's not what he'll actually pay, and it's not yet clear what his real life damages are, because there are some people who still celebrate him, and so it's not clear that this is lifetime damaging for him. And some would argue this actually enhances his brand, which is crazy to think about. But there are ways in which one could see this as a martyr now, and he's like, oh, hey, he can use this as a badge of honor in some of his community. And that's why this is also dangerous in my mind.
Yeah. And so finally, Alan, what would you say about the Disinformation Summit? And for those people, the QR code will bring you to this webpage where you can get more information about that.
So I'm in the process of building this now, and so I should say I've been in the process of building this for 2 years, but we're in the process of actually formalizing the schedule for this. We're going to do in-person meetings at King's College in July, and the idea here is to facilitate interdisciplinary future research. So we're going to get a lot of learning done, and again, the key is interdisciplinary, because I know many information scientists who are looking at this, but typically siloed. So journalism's been looking at this for a long time, psychology, sociology. So there have been a lot of pockets of people looking at disinformation. Accountants didn't even realize really that we were looking at it, because we call it fraud. So the idea is to pull all of us together and figure out what can we do collectively. How can we cross flow ideas? I just had a call with a videographer team. We will webcast this. We're going to have in-person meetings. We're going to have a fabulous keynote. I won't announce who it is because we're still coordinating that. But again, the idea here is just, I would say this is the first of many in my mind, because I don't think disinformation is going to go away. But the idea is we're going to convene so we can think more carefully about what is this? What can we do about it? How can we learn more about it? How can we inform practice about it better? How can we inform ways of mitigating the risks better? And that's kind of the intent around the summit.
Yeah, and Catherine posted this comment about Professor Melanie Trecher-King, who's done some interesting work here. And
yeah, if you can send that link to
them.
me, an email or something, I'd love to connect. And by the way, we have a LinkedIn. I think I mentioned it several times. We have a LinkedIn feed, so you can either connect with me or connect into the LinkedIn feed directly, and you'll get some information updates. And that's designed to be interactive, but right now I'm the only one posting, but people can interact in there as well.
Well, thank you so much, Alan, for speaking to us about this very important topic. I think it's one of the most, if not the most important topic that resonates throughout the world at the moment, because it just, as you say, it accelerates, or you call it an accelerant. I almost call it a retardant in some ways for meaningful progress in all the major issues.
It accelerates the bad stuff and it retards the good stuff in my mind, in my framework.
And I think the worst thing is it just erodes trust in institutions, into people. So I think this is one, it's great that you are really pushing this in your work and through the Disinformation Summit. So if I'd encourage everybody, just go on the website, go on the YouTube channel, LinkedIn, and engage on this very important topic.
And a shout out to all the people who are supporting this, and to Cambridge University for giving me the platform to collect everybody and build this. I think this could be some of the most interesting things it'll certainly be the most interesting stuff I've ever done. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much to all our viewers. Our next episode is going to be same time next week. It's going to feature Vanessa DeCao, the Managing Director of Clinical Services International. She's also a CJBS Advisory Board member. She has lots of experience in the healthcare industry, and she's going to talk a bit about, well, what can we do to control and maybe even lower the costs of healthcare? So you can join us 18th of November, 12:45 to 1:30. And with that, I want to thank again all our viewers and Alan for joining us.
Yeah, it's an honor. I really appreciate the opportunity. And thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us.